Good afternoon, or it could be actually good evening or good morning, depending on what time zone you're in. But you're in the session right now, VFP and thin clients. If you didn't want to be in this session, you can leave. No one will really know. But hopefully you wanted to be here, because right now we're going to learn some very, very interesting things. This is the update of a session that originally was given, about 11 or 12 years ago, actually. And when I was updating it, it was interesting because I thought, oh, you know what? I bet Microsoft has changed a lot of its rules and, sorry about that, a lot of its rules and policies in the interim. And surprisingly enough, it did not. Microsoft is one of those places that changes very slowly. All right. We should all be connecting to terminal servers, or should we? Because VFP apps can be centrally located, accessed from anywhere. One of the things that often are called hosted applications are really applications running over thin clients, because thin clients eliminate the distribution setup. We're going to see all these different things and how it works with VFP as we go through the session today. About Vinitsky Consulting, the rules of Southwest Fox and even virtual Southwest Fox required me to tell you why you should listen to me. And this is why. My company develops and markets vertical applications for nonprofit organizations, and I've been involved in Fox Pro since back in the days of Fox Base and CompuServe. My user number was 10031,510. And one of the things I like doing is taking VFP and seeing how I can connect it to things around it in the outside world. Now, there's going to be a lot of talking in the beginning of this presentation, because in order to understand how to integrate VFP with our thin client, we have to understand a little bit about the thin client, which will be RDP and terminal services. So we have to learn a little bit about that to have sort of a grasp on that. So there'll be a bit of sort of talking and interesting ideas before we actually get to the VFP section. Our agenda today is going to be four things. We're going to learn about thin clients. We're going to learn about terminal services. We're going to learn about VFP issues. And then we're going to learn about remote apps. Those are the things we're going to learn about today. Let's start off with learning about thin clients. Now, technically, a thin client is a computer that depends on another computer for processing. That's all that requires in order to be called a thin client. Now, even though it's not technically necessary, usually a thin client has some way to display results and enable input to be sent to the remote computer. Now, most of you are probably too young to remember the original IBM mainframe days with the green screens. And those green screens had a screen and a keyboard, and the screen and the keyboard had wires connecting them off to the server somewhere. And that was the very, very first thin client. A dumb terminal is nothing more than a thin client, because the mainframe did all the work. You typed in the keyboard and it sent those keystrokes into the mainframe, and the mainframe sent a visual display back to your dumb terminal. If you were to disconnect your dumb terminal from the mainframe, it would be useless. That's one of the ways you can determine you have a thin client, is if you disconnect the connection to the server, do you have anything useful left? Now, a thin client can actually be software or hardware. And we usually think of it as software, but the truth is it doesn't have to be. One of the original thin clients was those WISE terminals. If anybody remembers those, if not, there's a little picture there to jog your memory. And all there is the monitor and the keyboard and a little stand to hold all the wires, and it connected into your PC. Now, you don't see those too much anymore. They do still make them, actually, but you don't see them very much. Normally, when we think of thin clients today, we think of the software idea of a thin client, where a thin client has a connection between my local machine and the server on the other end. And I actually have, in my end, something that's capable of processing, but it's functioning as a dumb terminal. We don't usually think of the actual dumb terminals the way we used to in the old days. Now, with the popularity of web apps and things like Ajax, the purely dumb terminal paradigm broken. So now everybody likes to refer to thin clients as either thin clients or zero clients. You can illustrate this with the difference between RDP and a web application. When you are remote desktoping into another machine, the machine you're on running the remote desktop isn't doing anything. It's not processing anything. It's not running applications. It's not saving any data. All it's doing is displaying the results that come back from the server and sending input via the keyboard or the mouse. Therefore, it's a zero client. Web applications are running on a terminal that's fully functional. Your PC is running the web application. However, it's functioning inside a lot like a dumb terminal by sending information back and forth. And so people like to call that a thin client and the RDP type a zero client. However, colloquially, amongst IT people, generally speaking, we use the term thin client. There's really no differentiation today for our purposes. And in fact, it's sometimes a distinction that doesn't distinguish anything. So we're going to continue to use the term thin client, even though theoretically there's a difference between a thin client and a zero client. Now, there are a lot of types of thin clients. More accurately, there are a lot of types of protocols. The thin clients are named after the protocols that are used to communicate between the terminal and the server. So, for example, the telnet protocol uses the telnet thin client uses the telnet protocol to connect to the server. An ICA thin client uses the ICA protocol. An RDP thin client uses the RDP protocol. We don't really have names for the thin clients themselves. We call them by what the protocol is that they're running. Now, RDP is probably familiar to everyone. That's Remote Desktop Protocol. It was developed by Microsoft, and it's used primarily in Windows servers, and we're going to talk about that at length more. The ICA protocol was originally used by Citrix in its MetaFrame product. I don't know if anybody remembers those. It's a little bit more recent than mainframes. Now, VNC, which some of us may use, is actually a thin client. It has a graphical capabilities, and it uses the RFB protocol. So VNC, sometimes you'll see VNC/RFB as the name of it. SSH is secure telnet. XML, JSON, HTTP, those are all types of clients, but really they're types of protocols. You don't have an XML client, it's an XML protocol. Now we have to have a little history lesson. So I press the right button. We have to have a little history lessons. Thin clients originated on the mainframes. As we mentioned, there was just a reader. Originally, it was punch data. Now, this is going way back, but when I first started at Northwestern University, it was still punch cards. While I was a student there is when they started getting actual terminals where you could type. And boy, were those popular. And the first rule was if you weren't a senior, you couldn't have one because they were in such demand. So the underclassmen were always trying to make deals with the seniors in order to get one where you could actually type on. Then what happened is the local area network came along, and we discovered something called thick clients. Now, if you think thick clients are the opposite of thin clients, you're actually right. Because thick clients run the application, process data directly from your computer you're sitting at. This one person, one machine model became prevalent with the popularization of the PC. Now, there's another reason why when the PC and network became popular, if you remember the original Novell and Lantastic networks, right, is that the servers were not powerful enough in those days to allow the connection of dumb terminals. While there were some dumb terminals that could run, it required a certain amount of upgrades to the server and a lot of specialized equipment. So therefore, the PC brought us to the idea of the thick client. I sit down and I run Word on my computer, and I save it off into the server somewhere, nowadays off into the clouds. And that's what we call the thick client. That was the status for a long time. Then in 1995, we're getting more and more recent, the Citrix company released a product called WinFrame. Now, WinFrame was a modified version of the Windows NT server. And some of the people who are younger in the group here might be thinking, what is he talking about? But it gave the server the ability to become a server for multiple thin clients. WinFrame was run on top of a Windows NT server. And then the client stations used the ICA protocol to connect to this server. And Citrix licensed the Windows Server source code for Microsoft, and thus was able to ensure that it was well integrated. Well, guess what happened? Microsoft was none too pleased with that plan. As they prepared to go to Windows NT4, they wouldn't license the source code to Citrix. So there was a huge round of negotiations and legal threats and all kinds of things. And eventually Microsoft licensed the Citrix technology and renamed it Terminal Services. So what we run today as RDP and Terminal Services is really thanks to the Citrix company and the inability of Microsoft and Citrix to get along. And since Microsoft wouldn't license the source code to the server, it bought out the right to the Citrix technology. Citrix can still sell products using the technology, but all the technology now belongs to Microsoft that used to be part of Citrix. If you can't beat them, buy them. Now, with each version of Windows Server, then Microsoft enhanced the terminal services capability. Citrix expanded its offering. Currently, Microsoft and Citrix are friends again, and they have agreements to develop and expand other thin client offerings. Now, Microsoft subsequently rebranded Terminal Services, and we're going to get to that in a little while. So you keep hearing me use the word Terminal Services. Keep that in the back of your mind because we will come back to that, why it's called Terminal Services. Now, originally, Microsoft had an RDP protocol, remote desktop protocol, that it used from the Citrix material to allow computers to be thin clients into Windows servers. But it only allowed Windows servers, Windows clients. If you had a Mac or any kind of mobile device, too bad for you. So third parties started making clients for Mac and Linux and other operating systems, and Microsoft wasn't such a fan of that, so Microsoft decided to make their own. Nowadays, almost any device you can imagine can connect via RDP to a Microsoft server. Microsoft itself currently sends mixed messages. On the one hand, they're big fans of distributed computing. On the other hand, they're big fans of thin clients as well. And as so often happens, we get mixed messages from Microsoft. Now, there is a little bit of confusion here about something called thin clients and something called remote control. In the old days, we used to use something called remote control for tech support, like PC Anywhere. But nowadays, it has a renewal in popularity thanks to programs such as TeamViewer. It seems a little bit unclear what's remote control software and what's a thin client. Now, strictly speaking, remote control software is a thin client. Remote control software, though, is generally intended for a one-to-one relationship. In other words, we have one local computer operating one remote computer. So, for example, on a remote control system, we have the PC, and then we have a remote PC running TeamViewer. That's it. That's the whole world that these computers are in. I cannot take more remote PCs and connect them into here. It's a one-on-one relationship. So technically it's a thin client. We call it remote control because it's one computer controlling another and not connecting in. Whereas with a typical thin client arrangement, each user sees their own desktop and really has no idea what other users are or are not connected. The central server runs independent desktop sessions, and there's no communication from one session to another. Now, thin clients have a lot of proponents and a lot of detractors. There are people that will tell you thin clients are the be-all and end-all of the world, and there are people that will tell you thin clients, don't waste your time. A quick summary of the pros and cons of thin clients will help you make that decision. Let's start with the cons in an unusual way of doing it. The biggest con is it can't function if the network connection fails, which gives it a single point of failure. That's the biggest con to thin clients. And there's often less functionality, like web-based thin clients have a lot less functionality than a local PC might have. But the pros overwhelm the cons tremendously. All you need at the user end is a cheap piece of hardware. You can take an old XP machine and poof, it's your dumb computer. You don't need to keep up with the technology on the desktop. It's easier testing, easier security. You can have Mac and mobile and all kinds of things without any work whatsoever. It can be scalable. It utilizes the server better, single point for security management. And we'll get to it later when we do deploying. But for as many users as there are, doesn't make any difference, one executable file. So instead of updating 500 users of your program, you update one user. Now, that gives us a basic idea of the concept of thin clients, or hopefully does give us a kind of idea. I'm going to talk just for a moment and see if anybody has any questions about the idea of thin clients.
Nope, everybody seems to be with you. There's lots of discussion of what old setups they used.
All right. Oh, you should see my office here. I've got some old PC. I could start a museum here. All right, terminal services. Terminal services is the client commonly used in conjunction with VFP on a terminal server. Now, the technology is a little bit confusing, and Microsoft has muddied the waters like you wouldn't believe. Now, we're going to be using a terminal services with our Windows 2019 server for our examples. But Microsoft decided one day out of the clear blue sky to rebrand terminal services as remote desktop services, because the server would be running remote desktop services and the client in Windows would be running the remote desktop application. Now, the difference between remote desktop and terminal services is absolutely nothing. And therefore, it's still common amongst IT people to call it terminal services. But to be politically correct, terminal services is the software running on the server. That server is a terminal server. So I'm running terminal services on a terminal server. So the first thing I need in order to have my VFP app functioning over my thin client setup is I need a terminal server. And I need it to be running terminal services, which Microsoft is now calling remote desktop services. Now, when you have a server that's running a terminal services, in other words, a terminal server, let's say Windows 2019, Microsoft requires licensing, and every server running terminal services, every Windows server must be connected to a TS licensing manager server somewhere. You can have one licensing server for a lot of different Windows servers, but you must have a licensing server somewhere. And each remote user requires their own license. The licenses are not shared, or they're not based on simultaneous usage. The licenses are known as CALs. And if you think that's complicated, you can see nothing yet. When you set up a terminal server, when you install Windows 2019 with terminal services, there's a one-time irrevocable decision you have to make. Do you want to license this server per device or per seat? Now, the white paper has a lot more details about the ramifications of that, but we can take a look at what Microsoft claims to be some of the differences. A CAL per device means that every physical device has a license. So therefore, it doesn't matter who's logged in. It doesn't matter their name. But let's say I have a company. I'm just thinking of a client of ours that runs 3 shifts, 3 8-hour shifts a day. And when each person leaves their shift, the next person sits down at that same computer. So rather than have 3 user CALs, they have 1 device CAL for that particular device. Now, if you have a situation where multiple people are using the same computer, then setting up your server as a per device server makes perfect sense. Otherwise, setting it up as per user makes sense. Every user has a license assigned to them, and you have to have Active Directory. And it's not simultaneously. So if I have 10 CALs and I assign them to 10 users, that does not mean 10 users can log in at the same time. It means those assigned 10 users can log in at the same time. If someone logs in who's not one of those 10 users, even if no one else is on the server, they're considered to be unlicensed. So the licensing structure is not exactly what we call friendly. Currently, CALs go for about, for 5, it's $720. I think you can buy them 1 at a piece for about $120. But they start at $720 for 5 licenses. So let's figure that's about $120 per license. So one of the problems with the Windows terminal server is the licenses can add up. The licenses can significantly add up. If I have 500 users in my system, my Active Directory system, all of whom at some point need to log on, I need 500 cals. So terminal services licensing is a little bit complicated and can be expensive. The good side is that once it's set up and running, it's pretty much a run it and forget it. Now, terminal services, remote drive and device. Here's something that completely breaks the paradigm of the thin client. When I log on to my terminal server, I get a desktop. Now, this desktop is a virtual desktop created for me by my terminal server. And as long as I have the security rights, I can do anything from this desktop that any user on the server can do. There's no limit. So this is also a popular way for administrators to connect in and administrate the server, because they can do anything that they could if they were logged in from the console. Now, Microsoft keeps slipping in features into RDP that really don't fit the thin client paradigm, but which turn out to be popular features. Let's say, for example, a server has a C drive, and a local PC has also a C drive. Now, when I connect to the terminal server, the user might have an FGC drive. Those are drives on the server. However, the session can be configured that the user not only has those drives, but also can use their own local C drives. This is extraordinarily confusing, and you know, we're going to go and we're going to take a look at this in person because it's a little hard to see here. So we're just going to switch over. So right now, I'm connected to a terminal server. I have my own desktop, my own virtual desktop, and there could be thousands of other people connected. I can't see their desktops. Now, if I open up the computer here, I'll see something very interesting. Here's the C and D drives that are on the server. That's normally where I'd be working, just like I was sitting in front of the server. A good thing to remember is you should think of it as if you're sitting in front of the server. However, what's this thing down here that says C on TPV1? That's the C drive on my local computer that I use to connect in. Thin clients shouldn't have a C drive. That shouldn't be possible. Nonetheless, Microsoft added that in so that people can copy things from the server to the local drive. Now, most administrators shut off this ability because you can copy things from the server to your local drive. I could log in and copy the system company's entire last month's financials onto my local C drive. Nonetheless, it is a convenient way to allow users to save things that may be needed later when they're not connected to the terminal server. You know, there is one thing about terminal services that's a nightmare. Let's not call it a nightmare. Let's call it interesting. And that is printing. Now, what's supposed to happen is that I log on to a terminal server and I have a printer connected to my local printer. Follow me here. I should be able to print from the server back to my local printer. Again, shooting the thin client out of the water. So what Microsoft Server does is when you log in, it looks to see what local printers you have, and it makes a corresponding virtual printer for you to use to print to it. Now, if it doesn't work, it can be a nightmare. The number 1, 2, and 3 source of technical support for people running Windows terminal servers are printing. Without any question about it. Now let's take a look and see here in our remote connection. Let's first look at my local C drive. Now on my local C drive, I have a computer called printer called HP LaserJet P3005 PCL6. Right, now remember that. LaserJet P3005. Now, when I connect to my terminal server, Let's see what happens with my devices here. I go to devices and printers, and look what I have. I have something called a Microsoft HP LaserJet P3005 PCL6. Is this connected to the server? No. It's connected right next to me on the chair here. And the clue is that it is redirected. So when I logged in, terminal server said, aha, on the system you're connecting from, on your thin client, they're running RDP, you have a printer. So we're going to try and make that printer work virtually so you can print back to your own PC. Otherwise, I could be printing to a printer connected to the server, and that server could be in Timbuktu, which would be a little bit of an issue. And if you look at the details on these virtually created printers, you'll see that it has weird port names. This port name is TS006. Those are auto-created, and as soon as I log out of the terminal server, that printer goes away. Now that sounds really like a great idea, doesn't it? Yay! Except for one problem. It doesn't always work, because I gave a very easy example of an HP LaserJet 3005, which is a pretty standard and common printer. Let's say I log in with a printer, and Windows Server doesn't know what my printer is. So it'll try and default to use some standard generic printer driver, which almost never works. So therefore, the user will call up and say, I can't print. What really is happening is that Microsoft Server cannot figure out how to recreate that printer driver. And does it give an error message? No. Does it tell the user anything? No. It puts an entry into the error log. So if you're looking for the downside, the real downside of using terminal servers on a day-to-day basis is you have to make sure that your clients that are connecting in have printers, and the printers are all going to be redirected properly once they connect in. Now, about terminal services, support tech. A really good feature that more than makes up for the printing issue is the ability of technical support to support these users. In fact, a number of years ago, the head of my support department came to me and said, that's it. Anybody who's not on the terminal servers, we won't support them anymore. Too difficult. Too difficult to do. When I'm connected to a terminal server, I can see who's connected, and I can watch them work. Let's go back to our terminal server. I can actually watch them work. This is a list of everybody that's connected right now to this terminal server. The only person connected is me. So I see all the users connected here, and I right-click and select remote control, and I literally am shadowing. I'm literally watching on the screen everything that they're doing, and I can actually click the mouse. It's like the old PC Anywhere or TeamViewer on steroids. They can keep working, and I can watch them and interact with them and see exactly what they're doing. And I never have to worry about connecting into anybody. All I do is I sit here and I click on whichever user is called in for technical support. I see what they're doing. I tell them how to fix it and go to the next one. No connecting, nor do we have a connection, no what's the password, none of those things. All tech support can be done by right-clicking the users are connected and seeing exactly what they're doing, right or wrong. We all know users will often say things like, no, I didn't change anything. No, I didn't do this. So our support people will right-click, and they'll control it and say, oh, well, then how come you did this? Oh. So the tech support, if you will, more than makes up for the issues with printing. Now, administration of terminal server and configuring it initially is a skill that most network administrators don't have. If you walked up to your generic Windows Server network administrator and said, configure me in the terminal server, please, they wouldn't know how to do it. Now, for our own selves, basic administration is not difficult to master. There's plenty of guides out there, and it's not that difficult. However, it's sure to require advanced knowledge when you want to get the security configuration set up. And for that, you're going to have someone who really is knowledgeable about terminal services to set up the security. So you're going to need a terminal services administrator, at least on an occasional basis, in order to have a successful experience. Now we have our terminal server running. And we've got all of this set up beautifully, and we want to run VFP applications on our terminal server. The reason we should do that is that there's less bottleneck. If you have your VFP and it's connected to a SQL server, that's a lot of bottleneck going over the network. A thin client sends itsy-bitsy amounts of data. It just sends, whoa, redraw this screen. Ooh, I pressed an A. It doesn't send records from SQL Server. As I mentioned, the support is easier. One, executable, and if you're actually using database that's on the server, right? The access, for example, if you're actually using FoxPro tables, the access time is instantaneous. It's like you're sitting in front of the computer. Like all of your data was on your own C drive. Now, there are a couple of cons. The biggest one is sometimes users are a little uncomfortable when the fact that now their data is in the cloud. And this occurs whether it's a thin client or whatever it is. When you tell them their data is going to reside in the cloud, they get a little nervous. That sometimes can be an issue. And there is sometimes an opportunity for conflict the first time you start setting up your program if you haven't properly planned for deploying it on a Windows terminal server. All right, we're going to take a break right now and ask if there are any questions about this whole concept of running terminal services on the terminal server on a Windows server.
Okay, yeah, we got a couple of questions. One goes back to the license question and asks, do you have a better solution so that CALs can be shared?
No.
Okay.
Although I will tell you an interesting anecdote. You sometimes will see people running terminal servers, and if you check, they're running Windows Server 2008, which is a little outdated now. The reason is the per user licensing in Windows Server 2008 was broken. And so therefore you could have 1 million users and nothing would happen. But that's sort of not honest. Every server after that, Microsoft fixed that. There's not really much of a workaround for that. You can, if you are a Microsoft, what's we're looking for, open source, if you ever have a Microsoft connection, you can get the CALs for a lot cheaper. Those are the retail prices of CALs. If you have a Microsoft purchase agreement, you can probably get CALs for maybe $60 or $70 a piece. But I have no other workaround for you.
Okay. And the other was, how much juice does the server need to run 100 users?
That's an excellent question. Excellent question. I slimmed that out a little bit because, in the interest of time, that's an excellent question. So according to, that's what I'm looking for. You know what? Can I ask you to hold on to that question? Because in about 5 slides, we're going to cover VFP and memory, and I'll mention there how much memory, et cetera, you need in the actual server. So can I ask the questioner to hold that question for a couple minutes?
I'm sure that's fine. And that's all we have right now.
Okay, and you know what? If I don't fully answer that question, don't let me get away with it.
Okay.
Now, we have made a wonderful, beautiful VFP application. This is the stunning glory of all VFP applications. And we'd like to run it on our terminal servers because we want all these wonderful benefits that we learned about in this session. There are a few things to be aware of. VFP loves memory. Now, a terminal server needs more RAM than a file server. And there is a formula you can use, but in general, we have servers here, and we figure that about 64 gig per 50 users. If it's more intensive than that, then we'll go to 128 gig per 50 users. After 128 gig, then we go to another server. So 100 users would probably be fine on a server with, let's say, anywhere from 60 to 128 gigs of memory. The memory is what matters, because terminal server is creating virtual everything is in that memory. So little things that we really don't do very much anymore in VFP for memory management, like we used to back in the days of FoxPro DOS, where we had 64K of RAM, are something you should start thinking about doing again. Release your memory variables, clear programs, clear resources, and there's a system function that I never even knew existed, which was sys 1104, which purges cached memory. Well, that's a wonderful function for terminal server, because terminal server is caching everything left and right, and FoxPro wants it to. Because FoxPro doesn't really know it's on a terminal server. It thinks, hot diggity, I got 128 gig of RAM, let's go to town. And not really, because we all know it won't use all that, but you get the idea. Now, sys 3050 and 3050 combo 1 set the amount of memory that VFP uses for buffers. Now, what you do is you start VFP and you check sys 3050 comma 1. And that will tell you how much memory VFP initially allocated for buffers. It's usually way more than it needs, in which case you can use 3050 to set it lower. Make sure that in your config.fpw, your MV count is at an appropriate value. Now, MV count is the maximum number of memory variables VFP can establish at one time. I just usually set it at like 50,000. Doesn't really matter because memory on a PC is nothing. However, lowering that number to a reasonable number results in VFP setting aside less reserved memory. Because if I put in this, I'm going to use 50,000 memory variables, it sets aside RAM for 50,000 memory variables. Bitmap equals off should be in your config FPW. That helps the drawing of the screens not be, what's what I'm looking for, shaky. You want bitmap equals off. The display will be tremendously improved. I'm not going to go into all the technical details of it, but your graphics will work much better if you have bitmap equals off. And you also may want to use, when you're updating forms or controls, something that I know some people use a lot and some people never use, which is lock screen. So if you set lock screen to true, nothing changes on the actual appearance or the actual display of VFP until lock screen equals false again. So I can set lock screen to true, change 50,000 control appearances, and then lock screen and false, and it updates all 50,000 at the same time. That's a much, much more efficient way than having it update every control of those 50,000 as I enter the command. Now, again, on a local PC, that might not be such a big deal. But when you have 100 other users all vying for the memory, it's easier to lock screen and let VFP do one big update. Now, when you're printing out of VFP, I've mentioned to you that the weakest area of technology and terminal services, I want to take that back, not the weakest, but the most prone to have unexpected issues. So we don't want to take any chances. These commands here never use, ever, 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 ever on an app that's going to run on a terminal server. Set printer 2, get printers, A printers, sys 1037, sys 102. They will not give you the right answers. Use the prompt keyword, not the promptee keyword, in the report form when you wish to allow printer selection. Don't allow a lot of times we give the user a choice of printers. Don't do that. Use the prompt keyword and let the user select their own printers. And never save reports with a printer environment. In other words, you have to have an environment that's printer agnostic. Show the report, let them pick what printer they want. Don't be smarter than the server. Don't try and make a list of printers. Don't try and change the default printers. Don't try and save the reports to the printer environment to make it look good. Be printer agnostic. Just pretend you don't have the foggiest idea what printers are going to come up and let the user deal with it when they print out their reports to the printer. UNC and Drives. Now, I don't say a lot. Myself and a few people I know, but certainly myself, have gotten into a lot of bad habits over the years. Visual FoxPro is a very forgiving platform. And usually, on a PC, there's an existence of a C drive. Never assume there's a C drive. A terminal server may or may not have a drive that's mapped to C. Do not assume there's a C drive. and never reference a drive or UNC directly. Never reference a CDE drive, never reference a / anything. Don't only relative paths. Never explicitly reference a drive or UNC because it may not be there. And if you want to know, how to deal with your relative paths, you can use the sys functions to determine where you started. The sys functions will tell you what folder the application started in, and you can work from there. Because remember, every user of that terminal server is running the same copy of VFP. It's like 100 people all crowded into your chair with you, all typing at the same time. So the config.fpw has to specify, for example, temp and work folders that are always accessible to every user no matter what. It's 100 people crammed into your chair typing with you. Oops, sorry. Now, if for some reason the network administrator has allowed this particular user to have access to their own local drive, don't access those drives. It's tempting to allow users to copy or save to them, but don't. Local drive access is slow, unreliable, and it's slow. I don't know if I mentioned this now, but it's very slow. Explicit file names. Oh, here's a bad habit that people get into. Now, again, I'm sure you're all thinking to yourselves, I don't have any of those bad habits. So these are for the people not in the session who have those bad habits. It's a poor practice anyway to use something like this. Select star from my file into dbf, ctemp, whatever. That's terrible practice. Nonetheless, it will work fine in a regular Visual Foxpro app. Under terminal services session, that is a crash because you cannot have multiple people saving to that same file. No explicit drives, folders, or file names that can cause a conflict. Remember, 50, 100 people sitting you, all using the same C drive, all wanting their own space on it. Now, with OLE and ActiveX in VFP, there's generally not a problem with ActiveX. Any ActiveX that will run on the server will generally, and runs in VFP, I have not come upon any issues with any ActiveX controls that we've ever used running under terminal server. Now, OLE works fine. I can open Word for my VFP app, but there's one big caveat that you have to realize. When you open Word, you're opening the Word app on the server, not the user's local Word app. Now, when we get to remote apps, this is going to be very important. In other words, you cannot OLE to something that's installed back on the local PC. You can only OLE to something that's installed on the server itself. Which means if you don't have Word on the server, you can never open Word. Now, therefore, it seems like if we're going to have different environments, it might be useful to know, is my application running on a terminal server? You might be able to bracket code that if I'm running on a terminal server, do this, if not that. And the Windows API has a call to determine if you're running on a terminal server or not. Unfortunately, it doesn't work. It always returns true. Well, actually, as you see in the next paragraph here, that's not really quite a lie. Because, interestingly enough, starting with Windows XP, terminal services was included in Windows. However, Microsoft never got it to reliably work, so it was turned off in all of those. Everything since Windows XP had terminal server capabilities in it. Everything. So therefore, if you ask the Windows API, is this a terminal server? It's always going to say yes. They couldn't get it to work, so they just left it in there. So the only way that I know of to get a reliable answer to whether or not you're running on a terminal server is to use some third-party tool. Now, I use the third-party tool from Josh Assing, an FLL that he wrote. Unfortunately, his website is no longer in existence, and I don't know if you can get it anywhere or not. If you can, it's very reliable. If not, I don't necessarily have a good piece of advice for you at that point. I don't know. I have to check and see if there's a license there, whether or not I can distribute that. I don't recall what the licensing terms were, and I went to his website to check, but I couldn't check because all that stuff is down. Okay, let's take another question break, if you would, and hopefully answer the memory question. And I'm sorry, I'm going to add one thing that's not in the slides, just a parenthetical note here. Versions before 9 of VFP supposedly will run on terminal server, but just don't. Right? Just don't. Right? VFP 9 was designed to run on terminal services. So stick with it. Okay, questions?
Just one. Do any of VFP's clear or release functions include the behavior of sys 1104, or must sys 1104 be explicitly called?
Good question. Sys 1104 must be explicitly called. There is no clear buffers that you can get from the command window other than sys 1104.
Okay, that was the only question right now.
All right, now, ladies and gentlemen, with a big drum roll, we are going to get to the ultimate crown jewel of all this. What we're going to do that's going to make our users, our clients, so happy that they're going to run up and give you a big hug and offer to give you lots more money, and that is remote apps. This is oh, I had a great example in mind of something that was the top, but this is it. This is the best. Now, normally, when I log in to a terminal server, I have my own private virtual desktop. I can run any application allowed by the security on my desktop. So let's take I'll look here. I'm going to connect to my terminal server. And I have a desktop. Now, from this desktop, I'm going to start my application Goldmine, a contact manager. I'm going to start Goldmine. I'm going to log in, and I see it. Now, let's actually do that. I'm going to open another connection. Open a connection to web host. I'm just going to have to squish it down to fit in this lower resolution here, if you don't mind. All right, I'm logging into the server. And I'll throw it up here for you to see. And I've logged into the server. And now I'd like to run my Goldmine application. So basically, this is a virtual desktop. And I want to run my Goldmine. So over here to my Goldmine. Run it. Oops, missed there. Missed. Come on. I need to be mouse impaired today. I get a login. And I'll log in. And here's my contact manager. It's a little hard to fit it on this screen here. And of course, I can do whatever I want with this. I can minimize it and continue to work on my desktop. Then whenever I'm done, I log off on my virtual desktop. And back to where I started from. Now, that's pretty cool. I got no questions about that. But let's make it a remote app. Watch what happens if we make it a remote app. We're going to add, what we do is we're going to go back in, and I'm going to go back to the same server again. Since I was so kind as to demonstrate how to log off. And every server has a program called Remote App Manager. Remote App Manager is pretty much like it sounds. It's a list of all the programs you want to be able to run remotely. So I added the Goldmine executable to this list. Now, here's the one downside to a remote app. Unlike just logging into a desktop, the user has to run and install on their local computer in order to be able to access remote apps. So I have to come here and I'm going to create a Windows installer package. and it's going to ask me questions like where I want to put it in the start menu, etc. It'll create that package for me, and I'll have to distribute that to my users. There's different ways of doing that, but the key point there is that you have to have some sort of installer or MSI, something run on the end user in order for them to be able to connect to a remote app. Now, once they've done that, it gets really cool. They get in their taskbar something called Remote Goldmine. Bring it over here. Now, look at this. It's asking me to log in. It's the same login I got when I was in my own virtual desktop, but there's no virtual desktop behind it. It looks like another window on my local computer here. And here's the same contact manager. Oh, look at all those things I was supposed to do today. That previously I opened up there. And what does it look like? It looks like just another window on my desktop. And it functions like another window. I can control Alt. I can go back and forth. I can print. That is cool. That is something that makes a VFP app seem very slick. Now, here, there is one thing to keep in mind. I'm going to switch back over to here. There's one thing to keep in mind when you are running a remote app. You can't confuse the user. If Goldmine is running as a remote app and it calls a Word macro, it's calling Word on the server. But since it looks like a local window, the user might become confused and think that they're opening Word on their desktop and wonder where their files are. So it's still only opening Word on the server, just like if you were connected to the virtual desktop. But nonetheless, I can have virtual applications, and I can have multiple ones, and no one ever has to know what's behind it. Now, this a little bit breaks some of the thin client. It makes it more like the web application idea, but nonetheless, very, very, very little network traffic. The only thing that goes across the wire is screen updates and when I type something in. Everything else is really still being done on the server, just like I logged in with my virtual desktop. And I can have any number of remote apps. There's no additional licenses needed for remote apps. It counts as part of the CALs that you have installed. I'm going to close this. Return back here to our presentation. All right, an overview of terminal services, how to ensure VFP compatibility, and how to use the creation of remote apps to give ourselves the best of all worlds. So we can have people log into our virtual desktop, or we can use remote apps. And either way, we can tremendously, tremendously increase the number of people that can access our app with a great deal of ease, with very little network traffic. Someone once asked me when we were discussing this, saying, well, then why do we make web applications? Why not just do this? Why not just have remote apps? And my answer was, good question. That's because somehow or other users have been told they want web apps. The only thing that I could possibly think of is that you don't have to install necessarily something before you run a web app. But I don't have to do anything to make my VFP application hosted other than move it to a terminal server. We had a big campaign with one of our virtual vertical market applications, and we announced we're going to our web hosted version. It's going to be so exciting for everyone. Or they can just connect in from anywhere. They can connect from home. They can connect from anywhere, and it's going to be great. They don't have to upgrade their own computers in the office. We'll take care of the backups. It's going to be terrific. And I was like, oh, great, we're getting this great web hosted thing. And of course, it was the same application, just running on terminal server. But it was true. We were doing all the backups. We take care of everything. And all they do is they connect in. I do want to mention that the latest white paper and slides can be gotten at these exciting locations here. And I have left about 7 minutes for questions. And before I take the questions, I want to make sure to remind you to fill out your evaluations. And I want to thank you for your intention, and I'll take any remaining questions at this time.
Okay, we had a couple of questions about the remote apps. Can the remote app be created on one server and used with a different server if all mapping is the same?
Yes, if all mapping is the same.
Okay. And what happens when your super cool VFP app running as a remote app uses COM automation to run Word or Excel?
It opens the Word or Excel that's on the server. So Word opens or Excel opens and does what it's supposed to do, but it's actually doing it on the server's copy of Word or the server's copy of Excel and not the user's own local copy.
Okay.
There is no way that I know of to have a remote app make an OLE connection to the Word that's on the actual local PC. However, if you can have access to the local PC, you can say, so what we do, we have, when they open Word, and we have a lot of Word macros and things, it opens up Word on the server, but it saves the document on their own local PC. So they don't really notice the difference, but it doesn't open Word on their own PC. It only opens it on the server. But whatever you have installed on the server, you can make a connection to. And a related topic is what happens if you have a really cool scanner on your PC or something like that that has to be shared. There's a way to do that also. Microsoft has a way to do that. It's beyond the scope of our discussion right now, but you can do that. I don't know if that answers the person's question or not.
Okay. I think that answered that question. I see a response to your the question about created on one server and used with a different one. Woody says, I beg to differ since the created RDP or installer contains the server address, thus it's not portable to a different server.
Well, you would have an IP address that goes round robin to different servers. In other words, if the application is installed on 3 different servers, you have an IP address that go to any one of those 3 servers. So we have an IP address that load balances. I mean, I got the idea the person was thinking about something like load balancing, where 50 users go to one server, 50 users go to another server, and 50 users go to the 3rd server. So therefore, everybody's connecting to the same IP, and the system is load balancing. If the person did not have that in mind, please speak up.
Okay, and
but I never argue with you, Woody.
Okay, and Reiner asks, is there no open on client function like in TS Plus to open created Word, Excel documents created on the server locally?
Could you ask me that one more time?
Is there no open on client function like in TS Plus to open created Word or Excel documents created on the to open Word or Excel documents created on the server locally?
So you want to open it on the server from your local Word. But you're running your local Word and you want to access a file on the server, or the other way around?
I think that's what the question is. And I think it's partly in response to the automation piece too. While you were speaking, there was a fair amount of discussion in the chat about TS Plus. And so I think it was, so apparently TS Plus has a way of doing that.
Yeah, if you're talking about from the PC client, opening Word on that client, and then asking it to open a document that was saved on the server on an earlier session, perhaps, right? There's no way to do that in terminal server.
And somebody is clarifying. The question is there a way using remote desktop to download a remote document to the local computer?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
That you can do. And then once the user is disconnected, they can do whatever they want with that document.
Okay. And here's another clarification from Reiner. The clarification is to open document locally after creation on server from the VFP application based on server.
If I understand the question, then yes.
Okay.
You can run a connection to Word on the server, and you can open a document that's stored on the PC local client. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I did. I think you've answered that, and I don't see any more questions, although there's still lots of chat going on. But of course, people who have further questions can come over to your Q&A and talk to you some more there.
Yep. As soon as I figure out how to get over there.
Right.
Just
okay. And I just want to jump in and thank you and all the other speakers. I want to remind everybody, please fill out your evaluations for all the sessions as well as the evaluation for the event as a whole. And watch your email for information about the fall conference. Thank you all for joining us today.